My hands were shaking when I closed the clasp on the document box, and I want to set that down plainly before I tell you anything else, because I have heard this story told back to me twice now by people who were not there, and both times they made me sound steadier than I was. I am a clerk. I have spent 19 years making other men's facts line up in neat columns, and in all that time, the worst thing that had ever happened to me at my desk was a spilled inkwell over the harvest accounts of a minor barony. I was not a man built for what came through the doors of the privy study that morning. I only happened to be standing beside the man who was. Pharaoh, Captain Blackwell said my name once low, the way he said everything, and I looked up from the box to find him watching me with an expression I had come to know well over the preceding weeks. Not impatience, never that, but a kind of quiet insistence that the moment be met on its own terms and not shrunk from. You have the ledgers in order. It was not a question. It never was with him. In order, I said. My voice came out steadier than my hands had any right to promise. Every page tabbed, every date cross-marked against the household accounts. If Lord Chancellor Thorne wants to check a single figure against the original entry, he can do it in under a minute. Good. He looked past me, down the long gallery toward the tall doors of the privy study, doors I had walked past 1,000 times in 19 years of service and never once been required to knock on. Beyond them, King Alaric was already waiting, because Blackwell had asked for this audience the evening before in 4 words. The king alone, urgently. And a captain of the household guard does not spend words like that carelessly, and everyone from the seneschal down to the boy who lit the morning fires had understood without being told that something was ending. I did not know, standing there with the box cold under my arm, that I was about to watch a queen's authority in the kingdom of Eldermore come apart in under 2 hours, quietly, without a single blow struck, entirely on the strength of paper and patience. I only knew that my hands were shaking, and that the guard beside me, a broad, still, unhurried man who had never once in the weeks I'd worked beside him, raised his voice above the volume needed to be heard, was the only person within 100 yards of me who did not look in that moment like the walls were pressing in. They'll ask you to speak, he said. When they do, speak plainly. Say only what the ledgers say, nothing more and nothing less. And if the queen consort is in the room. He was quiet for a moment. Down the gallery a footman crossed with an armful of linen and did not look at us. The way palace servants learn very young not to look at things that are none of their business, though of course everything within these walls is eventually everyone's business, sooner or later, once it has finished being a secret. Then you tell the truth to her face the same as you'd tell it to an empty room, Blackwell said. That is the whole of what I am asking of any man today, myself included. I want you to understand what we were carrying into that room, because if I simply begin with the doors opening you will not feel the weight of the box under my arm the way I felt it. And this story is, in the end, about weight, about how much truth a house can be made to carry before something in it gives. It had begun, as far as anyone could later reconstruct it, with a will. Not the king's will, he was, thank the stars, in good health that year, older than he had been but sound, but an old instrument tucked among the settlement papers of the crown, the kind of document that exists in every great house and is thought about by almost no one until the day it is needed. A regency instrument, drawn up years before and meant to say, in the driest and most necessary language the law provides, who would govern in the king's name and who would stand guardian to his grandchildren if illness or misfortune ever silenced him before his time. Captain Blackwell had found a version of that instrument sealed among a set of ceremony papers being readied for a formal reaffirmation before the Council of State. A small, unremarkable rite that happens every decade or so in every kingdom I have ever read about, the sort of thing that ordinarily makes no more noise than the turning of a calendar page. Except that when he read the names listed in the Council of Regency, in the clause that had always, in living memory, named the Crown Prince first among them, the name of Crown Prince Rowan was not there at all. It had simply and cleanly been left out, as though it had never been written in, and Queen Consort Morwenna's name stood in the place it should have occupied. He had stopped the ceremony. I was not present for that morning, but I heard of it within the hour. As everyone did, a guardsman had halted the sealing of a state instrument with his own body and his own voice, in front of half the council, and asked, with perfect and infuriating calm, to see the document's provenance before a single wax seal touched it. It should have ended his career on the spot. Instead, it began the unraveling of something much larger, because a halted ceremony is, if nothing else, a question that has to be answered, and the man asking it did not stop asking once the room had emptied. The second thread came a fortnight later, when Blackwell, working now with the Crown Prince's own quiet blessing, and increasingly with mine, since it was my ledgers he needed to trace where an old safe's key had last been logged, opened a long-neglected iron safe in what had once been the late Queen Isolde's private study, a room nobody had properly used since her death some years before. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was the true original of that same Regency instrument, witnessed and sealed years earlier in the proper form, Crown Prince Rowan's name exactly where it had always belonged, and beneath it, in Queen Isolde's own hand, a letter to King Alaric that she had never sent, written, by its date, only months before her death, in which she set down a fear she had apparently never spoken aloud to anyone but paper. That the woman who would one day become his second wife meant, in her patient and unhurried way, to make herself indispensable to the throne long after any grief for a first wife had faded, and that if anything ever seemed wrong with the succession papers, he was to look here in this safe, for the truth of the matter. It was, Blackwell told me afterward, the single strangest sensation of his career, reading a warning written by a dead woman that had waited years precisely for this. The third thread was the letters, a set of private correspondence belonging to Princess Ilara, some her own, some Isolde's, kept in a modest rosewood box in the princess's apartments, which Queen Consort Morwenna had been discovered, one ordinary afternoon, reaching for with her own hands while Ilara was elsewhere in the palace. Crown Prince Rowan had come upon her at it, and by every account I ever heard, gone white with a fury he did not raise his voice to express. It was Blackwell who stepped between them, and, with a courtesy so complete it was almost its own kind of accusation, informed the Queen Consort that the correspondence had already been placed under Crown Archive seal that very morning, on his own authority, for safe-keeping, a fact Morwenna had not known, and which told everyone in that corridor exactly how much she had wanted those letters, and exactly how little that wanting had to do with tidiness. And the fourth thread, the most recent, the one that still made my stomach turn when I thought of it, was the physician, a soft-spoken, well-credentialed man who had called himself Dr. Simeon Croft, brought quietly into the nursery wing by arrangement of the Queen Consort's own household controller to examine young Princess Malin after a spell of ordinary childhood tiredness, and who had pronounced, with grave and practiced concern, a condition serious enough to warrant her removal to a distant house in the country for a long and closely supervised convalescence, a house, as it happened, that answered to no one but Queen Consort Morwenna. Crown Prince Rowan had refused to sign the order. Blackwell, sent quietly to verify the man's credentials before any child left the palace grounds, had found that no physician by that name had ever been licensed to practice in any province of Eldermore, that the tonic he had prescribed did nothing but induce the very drowsiness he then diagnosed as illness, and that his fee, twice its stated amount, had been paid in 2 installments from an account belonging to the Queen Consort's controller, a man named Ivor Lassiter. The false doctor was, by the morning I am telling you about, already in the custody of the Crown magistrates, awaiting formal charges of fraud. Princess Malin was, thank every mercy, entirely well tired children being. It turns out, simply tired children, and not proof of anything darker unless a grown man wishes very badly to make them so. 4 threads. A will altered to remove a prince from his own father's regency. A safe that had waited years to correct it. A reach for letters that could only have mattered to someone with something to hide. A false illness invented to take a child out of her parents' hands and into a stranger's house that was not a stranger's house at all. Any one of them alone might have been an accident, an overreach, a misunderstanding smoothed over with an apology and a change of household staff. Captain Blackwell had spent 6 weeks proving, patiently, methodically, without once losing his composure or raising his voice to a soul, that they were not 4 accidents. They were one hand, moving 4 times. That was what was in the document box under my arm. That was the weight. "They're ready for you, Captain," said the equerry at the door. A young man named Ferris, whose face had the particular pale stillness of someone who has been told to expect a great deal and been given none of the details. He held the door only half open, as though some part of him hoped we might change our minds and go away. Blackwell did not hurry through it. That was the thing about him that I came, in those weeks, to understand as the true engine of the man. He was never hurried, not once, not when a ceremony needed stopping in front of half the council, not when a queen's hand was inches from letters that could unmake her, not now, with the whole weight of what we carried resting on the next quarter hour. He simply moved forward at the pace the truth itself seemed to require, no faster, and I had learned to match my own steps to his, because it was the only way I had found to keep my hands from shaking quite so badly. The privy study was smaller than I had always imagined it, from the outside. A long, low-beamed room with tall windows on the eastern wall that let the morning in across a great oak table scarred by 3 generations of royal signatures. And at the head of that table, King Alaric was standing rather than seated, which I noted the way a clerk notes everything, as a fact worth recording. He was a tall man going properly gray now, dressed plainly for a king, in a dark coat without ornament, and his face when he turned to us had none of the practiced pleasantness I had seen him wear at public audiences. It was the face of a man who had already been told, in outline, that something in his own household required his urgent attention, and who had spent the night since composing himself for whatever that something turned out to be. Lord Chancellor Cassius Thorne stood at his right hand, a spare, precise man with ink-stained fingers who I had worked under, at 2 removes, for a dozen years, and who nodded to me once briefly, in a way that told me he had already guessed this was no small matter if the clerk of the Privy Chamber had been summoned to attend it in person. And at the king's left, seated, their faces schooled into the careful stillness that palace children learn before they learn much else, were Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara. I had not expected them to be present, and I saw Blackwell register the same surprise, contained instantly behind his own stillness. "Your Majesty," Blackwell said, and I bowed a half-beat behind him, the box heavy and sudden in my arms. "Thank you for receiving us." "You asked for this audience in 4 words, Captain," King Alaric said. His voice was quiet, the particular quiet of a man conserving something. "I have spent the night since imagining 100 reasons a household guard would need to speak to me alone and urgently, and none of the 100 let me sleep. I invited my son and his wife because whatever this is, I have a strong suspicion it concerns them, and I would rather they heard it from you directly than from me second-hand, badly remembered, at some later hour. Was I wrong to invite them?" "No, Your Majesty," Blackwell said. "I would have asked for their presence myself, had I thought I had the standing to ask for anything at all in this room. You stopped a sealing ceremony in front of the whole council a fortnight ago," Alaric said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, a kind of tired, wintering patience. "I would say you have already established, Captain, that you consider yourself to have a certain standing when the matter is serious enough. I consider myself to have a duty, Your Majesty. I have never been entirely easy with the difference. For the first time since we had entered, the king almost smiled, a brief, involuntary thing, gone as quickly as it came, the ghost of the sort of dry humor that must once have been more native to his face than it had grown to be in recent years. Sit, all of you. Pharaoh, is it? Put the box down and sit. I find I would rather hear a hard thing seated than standing at my age. We sat. The oak table was very wide and very old, and the morning light lying across it caught the grain of the wood in long pale lines, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was a beautiful room to end something in, and that I had never before considered that a room's beauty and the gravity of what happened inside it might have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Before I open this box, Blackwell said, I want to say one thing plainly, so that no one in this room mistakes my purpose in the hour to come. I am not here to accuse anyone of anything my evidence cannot support. Everything Clerk Pharaoh and I have gathered in these past 6 weeks has been gathered through proper channels, cross-verified against the household ledgers, and where possible confirmed by more than one independent witness. I have tried at every step to be wrong. I would have been glad to be wrong. I was not. Then begin, the king said. And Captain, whatever this is, I would rather you told it whole than told it gently. I am not a man who is served well by having the hard part of a story withheld from him until the end. Blackwell opened the box. He began, as he had planned to, with the Regency instrument, laying the altered document on the table first, its seals intact, its clauses correct in every particular but one, and letting the king read the Council of Regency clause himself, in silence twice, before he said a single word about it. I watched Alaric's face while he read. I had spent 19 years learning to read the faces of powerful men doing arithmetic they did not want to be doing, and I saw the exact moment the king reached the clause and understood what was missing from it, because his whole body went still in a different register than a moment before, a stillness that had gone cold rather than merely quiet. My son's name, he said very low, is not in this instrument. No, Your Majesty, Blackwell said. It has not been, since some time in the past year, as best Clerk Pharaoh and I have been able to establish from the archive's own dating marks. This is the copy that was to be resealed and reaffirmed a fortnight ago. At the ceremony, I halted. Crown Prince Rowan had gone very quiet beside his father, the particular quiet of a man who has just been shown, in cold official language, that he had been quietly written out of his own family's contingency for governing without his knowledge or consent. Princess Alara's hand found his under the table's edge. I saw the small motion of it, and I looked away, because some things a clerk records and some things a clerk simply witnesses and lets be. Where is the true instrument? The king asked. The one this was made to replace. Here, Your Majesty, Blackwell said, and drew the second document from the box, the oilcloth-creased original, its ink faded to brown, its seals older and heavier, and set it beside the first, so that the two lay side by side on the pale oak, the false and the true, close enough that anyone in the room could have leaned forward and compared them clause for clause. Found 6 days after the ceremony, in an iron safe in the late Queen Isolde's private study, where it had rested, sealed, for a number of years. At the mention of Isolde's name, I saw something move across the king's face that had nothing to do with documents or seals. A private grief, old but not healed, the kind a man learns to carry without letting it show and cannot always manage to hide from those who are watching closely. He reached out slowly and laid 2 fingers against the true instrument's seal, not breaking it, simply touching it, the way a man touches a thing that has come back to him from further away than paper usually travels. And this, Blackwell said when the king's hand had withdrawn, was beneath it. He set down the last item from the first half of the box, a single folded letter, the paper gone soft with years in the dry safe, Isolde's hand unmistakable even to me, who had never met her, because I had spent a decade cataloging the royal correspondence and could have picked her looping, hurried script out of 1,000 other hands blind. King Alaric did not read it aloud. He read it once silently, and I watched his jaw work once and then go still, and when he had finished he folded it again along its old crease with a care that made my own eyes sting unexpectedly, and set it down, and did not speak for what felt like a very long time. "She knew," he said finally, to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of us, or perhaps only to the folded letter under his hand. "She was ill and frightened, and she still thought to warn me, and I never once opened this safe in all the years since, because I could not bear to be in that room." "You could not have known it was there to open, Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Thorne said, gently, the first words he had spoken since we entered. "No," the king agreed, "but someone else, it seems, suspected there might be something worth finding, and went looking for it long before Captain Blackwell did." He looked up, and his eyes, when they found Blackwell's, had gone hard in a way I had not yet seen them go. "Who altered the sealed instrument, Captain?" "I assume that is the question the rest of this box intends to answer." "It is, Your Majesty," Blackwell said, "but I would ask leave to lay the whole of it before you first, in the order it happened, before we speak names. Not to delay you, because I do not believe you will trust any single name I offer until you have seen how many separate threads lead to the same hand." The king looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, sat back in his chair, the first time he had properly sat since we entered the room. "Go on then, Captain. Lay it all out. I find I am no longer in a hurry to hear the end of this story. I would rather understand every step of the road that led here." "Then I will ask leave to bring in one witness before I go further," Blackwell said. "An old man who knew Queen Isolde's hand and Queen Isolde's seal better than any archivist now living, and who can tell you himself, in his own words, that the letter you have just read, and the signature on the true instrument both came from the same pen he watched her write with for 30 years. The king's eyes flicked to me, as though I might know who was meant, and I did, because Blackwell had asked me 2 weeks before to locate the man's pension records and had gone, alone, one gray afternoon, to the small caretaker's cottage on the kitchen garden wall where he had lived since his retirement. "Godfrey Lynn," I said, before I quite decided to speak. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. He served as Queen Isolde's private secretary for the whole of her life at Harrogate. He has been retired 11 years. "I remember him," the king said, something softening briefly in his face. "A careful little man, terrified of ink blots. Bring him in, Captain, by all means." Ferris was sent, and returned some minutes later with an old man leaning on a blackthorn stick, dressed with the fussy neatness of someone who has spent a lifetime being tidy on other people's behalf, and cannot stop being tidy on his own now that there is no one left to be tidy for. Godfrey Lynn bowed to the king with a shake in his knees that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with age, and when he straightened he looked, for a long moment, at the 2 documents lying side by side on the table, and at the folded letter beside them, and something crossed his face that I can only describe as an old grief finding, after many years, somewhere useful to go. "May I, Your Majesty?" he asked, and at the king's nod he came forward, slow on the stick, and bent over the papers with the particular close attention of a man who has read 10,000 pages in his life, and trusts his own eyes over any other proof in the world. "This is her hand," he said, after a moment, tapping the letter with one knuckle, careful not to touch the paper itself. "I would know it blind. See here how she loops the tail of her G's back under the line. She did that her whole life, ever since she was a girl. Her old governess told me once, because she'd been taught it was elegant and never unlearned it even when it slowed her down. And this seal." He turned to the true instrument, peering at the wax. "This is the old privy seal of her household, retired the year she died. I know it because I was the one who packed it away myself, wrapped it in the same oilcloth you have there, Captain, and put it into that safe with my own 2 hands, on her instruction, not 4 months before she passed." "You knew it was there," the king said quietly. "All these years you knew, and you said nothing." "I did not know it would ever be needed, Your Majesty," Godfrey Lin said, and there was no apology in his voice, only a plain old man's plain regret. "She told me only that if anyone ever came looking honestly for the truth of the succession papers, I was to tell them where to look, and not before. I did not think, in 11 years of quiet, that anyone ever would come looking. I had begun to believe she had worried over nothing." He looked at Blackwell, and something like gratitude moved behind his tired eyes. "I am glad to have been wrong, Captain, though it grieves me it took this long." "Thank you, Master Lin," the king said. "You may sit if you wish it. I would like you to remain if you're able." The old man sat, gratefully, in a chair near the window, and Blackwell returned to the table, and I felt the room's attention gather itself again, the brief human warmth of the old secretary's testimony folding back into the harder business of what remained in the box. "The instrument and the letter tell you what was changed, and roughly when," Blackwell said. "They do not yet tell you who changed it, or why. For that I would ask Your Majesty's patience through 2 further matters, both of which will feel, at first, unconnected to a regency clause. I promise you they are not." He drew out next a slim rosewood box I had not seen before that morning, Princess Ilara's own. I would learn, lent for the purpose with her full knowledge, and set it on the table, and lifted the lid to show a modest stack of letters tied with ordinary ribbon, nothing grand about them at all, the sort of private correspondence any woman might keep from people she loved. "Princess Ilara," Blackwell said, turning to her directly for the first time, "will you permit me to describe briefly what happened to these 3 weeks ago? I would rather you told it yourself if you're willing, since it is your own experience and not mine to narrate for you." Ilara's chin came up, and though her voice was quiet when she spoke, it did not shake. "I had gone down to the winter garden with the children," she said. "I was not gone above half an hour. When I came back to my apartments, the queen consort was at my writing desk with the lid of this box already open, and 2 of the letters in her hand." She paused. She did not hear me in the doorway. I watched her for a moment before I spoke, because I did not at first believe what I was seeing. She was reading them very quickly, the way you read something you are afraid of being caught reading, not the way you read something that is simply yours to look at. "What did you do?" the king asked very low. "I said her name," Ilara said. "And she startled, genuinely startled, Your Majesty, not the small polite start of someone who has merely been interrupted. And she set the letters down, and said something about checking that the household linens had been properly aired in my absence, which made no sense at all, since linens are not kept in a writing desk, and we both knew it made no sense, and neither of us said so aloud. I came in perhaps a minute later, Crown Prince Rowan said, and this was the first time he had spoken since we entered the room, and his voice, when it came, was very controlled in the particular way of a man holding something back by main force. Ilara had sent a page for me. I found the queen consort still in the room, and I asked her plainly what business she had with my wife's private letters, and she told me she had been concerned for Ilara's state of mind, and wished to be sure nothing in her correspondence suggested she was, in the queen consort's words, carrying burdens alone that the family ought to know about. "A concern for your wife's welfare," the king said slowly, "conducted by reading her private letters without her knowledge, while she was out of the room." "That was my objection precisely, Your Majesty," Rowan said. "I did not raise my voice. I did not need to." Captain Blackwell arrived within moments. I understand now he had been informed almost as soon as it began, and it was he, not I, who resolved it. "I informed the queen consort," Blackwell said, "that the correspondence had already been placed under Crown Archive seal that same morning, at Princess Ilara's request, for safekeeping during the redecoration of her apartments." He paused. "That was not strictly true at the moment I said it. It became true within the hour because I rode to the archive myself and made it so, rather than be caught in a lie I had told to protect two people who had done nothing wrong. I would rather confess that to your majesty now, in this room, than have it discovered later and mistaken for something worse than what it was." The king looked at him for a long moment, and something almost like the earlier ghost of a smile crossed his face again, gone as quickly. "You lied to my wife to buy an hour, and spent the hour making the lie true. That is either the most correct thing I have heard all morning, Captain, or the most concerning, and I confess I have not yet decided which." "I would rather your majesty decided it was the former," Blackwell said, without a flicker of humor in his own face, "but I will accept whichever judgment the evidence supports." "Why would she want those letters?" the king asked, and though the question was addressed to the room in general, I understood, watching him, that he was not truly asking any of us. He was asking himself, and beginning, visibly, not to like the answer that was forming. "They are a young wife's private correspondence. What in them could possibly matter to a woman who has never in 9 years shown the slightest interest in her stepson's marriage?" "I do not know the full contents of every letter in this box, your majesty," Blackwell said. "That was not my business to know, and I have not read them. But Princess Alara has told me that among them are several letters from the late Queen Isolde, written to her in the months before her death, in which Queen Isolde set down, in some detail, and to a person she trusted, the same fears she recorded alone in the letter you have already read. A private correspondence is a much harder thing to dismiss as an old woman's fancy than a single unsent letter in a safe. Two independent accounts of the same fear, in two different hands, are the beginning of a pattern. I believe the queen consort understood that as well as I do, which is why she wanted them before anyone else read them closely enough to notice." The room was very quiet. Outside the tall windows I could hear, faintly, the ordinary sounds of the palace going about its ordinary morning: a cart on the gravel, a dog somewhere, a burst of laughter quickly hushed, the whole enormous machinery of Harrogate turning over exactly as it always did, entirely unaware that in this one low-beamed room its whole shape was about to change. "There is one more matter," Blackwell said, "and I will tell you plainly before I begin that it is the hardest of the four, because it touches a child, and I have tried at every stage of this inquiry to handle it as gently as the truth allowed." I saw Princess Alara's hand go to her throat. "Princess Malin is well," Blackwell said at once, before the fear in the room could fully form. "I want that said first and said clearly, so no one in this room spends the next 10 minutes afraid for her instead of listening to what I have to tell you. She is entirely well, your majesty, and was never in the danger that was represented to her parents. That representation is itself the matter I must lay before you." He told it plainly, the way he had promised the king he would tell everything. The physician who called himself Dr. Simeon Croft, summoned to the nursery wing on the arrangement of the queen consort's household controller after Malin had shown nothing more alarming than the ordinary tiredness of an active 9-year-old at the tail end of a long autumn, the grave diagnosis. The recommendation, delivered with great professional solemnity, that she be removed for a long convalescence to a house in the country that answered, as it happened, to no household but the queen consort's own. Crown Prince Rowan's refusal to sign the order releasing her, and Blackwell's own quiet verification over 4 days. That no physician of that name held license to practice anywhere in the kingdom, that the tonic prescribed produced the very drowsiness it was then presented as diagnosing, and that the man's fee, twice what he had declared to the household steward, had been paid in 2 installments from an account belonging to Ivor Lassiter, the queen consort's controller. "He is presently in the custody of the crown magistrates," Blackwell finished, "awaiting formal charges of fraud, which is a matter for the courts and not for this room. I raise him here only because his fee was paid from Ivor Lassiter's account, and Ivor Lassiter's name, your majesty, is about to become relevant to every other paper on this table." King Alaric had gone very still, the particular stillness I had begun to recognize in him as the outward shape of something enormous being held very carefully in check. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, which frightened me far more than shouting would have. "You are telling me," he said, "that someone in my own household attempted to remove my granddaughter from her parents' care, under a false diagnosis, paid for by the same purse that appears to have paid for the altering of my own son's place in the regency of this crown." "I am telling you exactly that, Your Majesty," Blackwell said. "I have tried for 6 weeks to find an innocent explanation that fit all 4 threads at once. I could not find one. I would be glad even now to be shown one I had missed." "And whose purse," the king said, "do you believe it to be?" Before Blackwell could answer, the tall doors at the far end of the privy study opened without a knock, and Queen Consort Morwenna came in. I had seen the Queen Consort perhaps a dozen times in 19 years of palace service, always at a courteous distance, always composed in the particular way that women who marry into thrones learn to be composed, as armor rather than as ornament. She was composed now. I want to say that plainly because it would be easy, telling this story afterward, to make her arrival sound like a woman walking into a trap she should have seen coming, stumbling, exposed. She did not stumble. She came in with her chin level and her hands folded before her in the pale gray silk she favored for mornings. And if she had been summoned in some haste, and she had, I later learned, been sent for the moment the false doctor's name was raised, on Blackwell's own quiet instruction to Ferris an hour before, nothing in her bearing showed it. "Alaric," she said, and then, seeing the room, the documents on the table, the old man by the window, Rowan and Alara seated with their faces schooled tight, her eyes moved once quickly across all of it, and something behind her composure recalculated, though her face itself did not change. "I was told you required me urgently. I did not expect a tribunal." "It is not a tribunal, Morwenna," the king said, and I heard, in the careful evenness of his voice, a man trying very hard to be fair to his wife before he had finished being furious with her. "It is an inquiry, and I would rather you heard it from me and from Captain Blackwell together than have it reach you in fragments from the household, the way such things usually travel." "An inquiry into what precisely?" "Into this," the king said, and turned the false regency instrument so that it faced her across the table. I watched her read it. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole affair, because I have turned it over so many times trying to decide what I actually saw and what I have, in the retelling, allowed myself to imagine I saw. What I believe I saw was this. Her eyes went to the Council of Regency clause, found the place where Rowan's name should have stood, and did not widen, did not flinch, did not do any of the things an innocent woman's eyes do when she is shown, for the first time, a forgery she had no part in making. They simply stopped, briefly, exactly where the missing name would have been. The way your own eyes stop on a word you already know is there before you finish reading the sentence. "This is an old instrument," she said. "Superseded, surely, by the reaffirmation ceremony a fortnight ago, which I understand Captain Blackwell interrupted before it could properly conclude." "It is the instrument that was to be resealed at that ceremony," Lord Chancellor Thorne said. "The one you are holding is not an old draft, Your Grace. It is the current instrument as it presently stands in the Crown's own settlement papers, absent your stepson's name." "Then it is an error," Morwenna said, without a beat of hesitation, "and I am glad, truly glad, that it was caught before the reseal. Clerical errors happen in documents of this age and complexity more often than any of us like to admit, Cassius, as you well know from your own archive." "A clerical error," Blackwell said quietly, "that happens to coincide with a witnessed original of the same instrument, correctly naming the Crown Prince, sealed years ago and hidden in a safe in the late Queen's private study. A safe, Your Grace, that only a small number of people in this palace would have known existed at all. Are you accusing me of hiding it there, Captain, or of removing something from it? Morwenna's voice had not risen, but something in it had sharpened, the way a blade sharpens rather than raises its pitch. Because if you mean to accuse me of tampering with a legal instrument of the crown, I would remind you that you are a household guardsman, not a magistrate, and that this inquiry, whatever you wish to call it, has no standing to try me for anything at all. No one is trying you, Morwenna, the king said, but I heard, underneath the evenness, the first crack of something that might have been doubt, and I think Morwenna heard it too, because she turned toward him and softened her whole bearing at once, the way a sail turns to catch a different wind. Alaric, look at what is being laid in front of you, she said. An old clerical draft. A safe that has sat unopened for years, opened now by a guardsman who, by his own account, has spent 6 weeks going through this household's private papers on his own initiative, without so much as informing me, his own queen, that he suspected me of anything. Does that not strike you, even a little, as a strange way to conduct a fair inquiry? He has built his case in secret and sprung it on me without warning, in front of my husband, my stepson, and a room full of witnesses, and I am asked to answer for 6 weeks of accusation in as many minutes. You are not being asked to answer in minutes, Your Grace, Blackwell said. You are being asked to answer at all, which I acknowledge you have not yet been required to do in the whole 6 weeks I have been gathering this. I did not come to you directly because a woman clever enough to alter a sealed instrument of the crown without leaving an obvious mark on it is also, I judged, clever enough to alter or destroy whatever else stood in the way of the truth, the moment she knew someone was looking for it. I would rather be accused of secrecy by an innocent woman than hand a guilty one the time to cover her tracks. I have made my peace with which of those 2 accusations I would rather live with. That is a very tidy justification for treating your own queen as a suspect in her own home, Morwenna said. It is, Blackwell agreed without apology. I have not pretended otherwise to anyone in this room, Your Grace, including you, now that you are in it. Lord Chancellor Thorne cleared his throat, and I saw, with a clerk's particular attention to the small mechanics of power, that he had been waiting for the right moment to speak, and had judged this to be it. Your Majesty, if I may, the Queen Consort raises a point that touches the law and not merely the feelings of the room, and I would be failing my office if I let it pass unremarked. Captain Blackwell has gathered a great deal of material through means that were, by his own admission, informal papers taken from a private study without a formal warrant of search, a safe opened without the Queen Consort's knowledge or consent, correspondence removed from a princess's apartments and placed under seal by a guardsman's own authority rather than by any process of law. I do not say any of it is false. I say only that if this were to proceed to a formal tribunal, as the gravity of the accusation might eventually require, defending counsel would tear the provenance of half this evidence apart before the first witness was sworn, and Your Majesty would be left with a scandal, a shattered household, and very possibly no conviction at all to show for it. The room went quiet in a different way than before, not the held stillness of shock, but the colder stillness of a door that had, for a moment, seemed to be closing. Are you telling me, Cassius, the king said slowly, that after everything laid on this table I may not be able to act on it? I am telling you that if you act on it as a matter of law, in the open, before a formal tribunal, you invite exactly the kind of procedural challenge that could unmake the whole case regardless of whether every word of it is true, Thorne said. I have seen it happen, Your Majesty, in matters far smaller than this one. The truth is not always enough, if the manner of finding it can be made to look like the greater wrong. I watched the king's face, and I watched something in it that I have not forgotten since. The particular exhaustion of a man who has just been told that the plainest reading of the evidence in front of him might not, in the end, be the version of events he is permitted to act on. He looked for one unguarded moment, older than I had ever seen him look at any public occasion, and I understood, watching him, that this was the moment Morwenna had been waiting for since she walked through the door, though she had not built it herself. The law had built it for her, out of nothing more than its own caution, and she had only to stand very still and let it work. "Perhaps," she said gently now, all the earlier sharpness folded away, "this has gone as far as it usefully can, Alaric. I do not say the captain acted from malice, I believe he acted from loyalty, misdirected as it may have been. But loyalty pursued this far outside the law becomes its own kind of danger to a house like ours. I would rather we quietly corrected the instrument's clerical error, returned the princess's letters to her with my apology for an intrusion I freely admit was clumsily handled, and let the matter of the physician be settled by the magistrates, where it belongs, without dragging the whole of this family through an inquiry built on papers no court would accept." It was, I thought even then, watching it happen, a genuinely skillful thing she had just done, not a denial, not quite, but a kind of gracious surrender on every point small enough to concede, offered in exchange for silence on the one point that mattered most, the pattern that tied all four threads to a single hand. I saw Crown Prince Rowan open his mouth to object, and saw his father's hand rise, very slightly, asking him to wait. "Captain Blackwell," the king said, "the Lord Chancellor raises a fair point of law. Do you have anything left in that box that does not depend on the provenance he has just called into question? Something that stands on its own, outside the safe, outside the letters, outside anything you gathered yourself in secret over 6 weeks?" Blackwell did not answer at once. He looked for the first time all morning, less than perfectly certain, and my stomach dropped at the sight of it, because I had spent 6 weeks coming to believe that this man simply did not run out of ground to stand on, and for one long moment, in that low-beamed room with the morning light going thin behind a passing cloud, it seemed as though he had. "There is one more thing, Your Majesty," he said slowly, "but it does not come from the safe, or the letters, or anything I gathered on my own authority. It comes from the household's own ledgers, kept in the ordinary course of business by clerks with no stake in this matter whatsoever, cross-checked against records any court in this kingdom would accept without argument. I would ask leave to send for one more person before I lay it before you. Not a witness I have coached, Your Majesty, a witness I have not yet spoken to at all." "Who?" the king asked. "Ivor Lassiter," Blackwell said, "the Queen Consort's household controller." For the first time since she had entered the room, I saw something genuine cross Morwenna's composed face. There and gone in under a second, so quick that I would not have trusted my own eyes if Blackwell had not, I noticed, been watching for exactly that, and seen it too. "My controller manages my household accounts, Captain," she said, recovering almost as quickly as she had lost her footing. "I fail to see what his presence adds to a discussion of clerical errors and misdirected concern for my grandson's letters." "Then his presence will cost us only a few minutes, Your Grace," Blackwell said, "and we will have lost nothing by asking." The king nodded to Ferris, who went out, and the room waited in a silence that had a different texture than any that had come before it. Not the shocked stillness of the will, not the private grief over Isolde's letter, but something more like the held breath before a verdict, in which everyone in the room, I think including Morwenna, understood that whatever walked through those doors next would decide the shape of everything that followed. Ivor Lassiter was a neat, unremarkable man of middle years, the kind of man whose whole professional value lies in being unremarkable, in balancing sums quietly, and never once giving his employer cause to think of him at all outside the columns he kept tidy. He came in with the particular brisk deference of a controller summoned unexpectedly to a room well above his usual station, bowed to the king, bowed, a fraction lower, to Morwenna, and stood with his hands folded in front of him in an unconscious echo of his mistress's own posture. "Master Lassiter," the king said, You manage the Queen Consort's private household accounts. I do, Your Majesty. 6 years now. Do you know a physician who went by the name Dr. Simeon Croft? I watched the small muscles around Lassiter's eyes tighten. Almost nothing. The kind of thing a man does when a question lands somewhere he had hoped it never would. I believe I arranged a payment to a physician of that name some weeks ago, Your Majesty, on the Queen Consort's instruction, for a consultation regarding Princess Malin's health. 2 payments, Blackwell said, and set a slim ledger on the table, open to a marked page, turning it so the king could read it without rising. The first on the 14th of the month, the second on the 22nd, both drawn from the same private account, both in your hand, Master Lassiter, both entered in your own household book under the heading Medical Consultation. Though the physician's declared fee to the palace steward's office, recorded separately in an entirely different ledger kept by a different clerk who has never in his life met you or the Queen Consort, was precisely half the total you paid him. I would need to check my records, Lassiter said. I do not recall the exact figures without them in front of me. They are in front of you, Blackwell said, and turned the ledger a fraction further, along with the entry 3 days before the 14th, for a quantity of sealing wax purchased from a chandler in the lower town who supplies, as it happens, only 4 households in this entire palace complex, and whose wax, once set and cooled, carries a very particular faint blue cast that comes from a dye he alone mixes into his batches, a dye no other chandler in Harrogate uses. Because he guards the recipe the way some men guard a family recipe for bread. He drew out last a small waxed sample I had not known he was carrying, a chip no larger than a coin, broken from the false seal on the altered Regency instrument, and set it beside a second chip, freshly broken. He told the room from a stick of wax found among Lassiter's own household supplies 2 days before, delivered by warrant of the king's own household steward, once Blackwell had established there was cause to ask for it. They are the same wax, Your Majesty, Blackwell said. I am not a chandler, and I will not pretend my own eye is proof enough on its own, but the chandler himself examined both samples yesterday afternoon, and will swear to it under oath if Your Majesty requires him to. There are only 4 households in this palace that could have purchased that wax. Yours, Your Majesty, the Crown Prince's, Princess Adela's, who has been in the country these 4 months and has not set foot in Harrogate since spring, and the Queen Consort's. Lassiter had gone very pale. I have kept ledgers myself for 19 years, and I know the particular kind of fear that lives in a man who is good with numbers and has just watched someone else's numbers, more careful than his own, close around him like a hand. Master Lassiter, Blackwell said, and his voice even now did not sharpen, did not press, remained exactly as level and unhurried as it had been an hour before over the first document on the table. I am not here to trap you into a confession you do not wish to give. I am here to ask you plainly in front of your king whether the wax that sealed the false Regency instrument came from your household stores, purchased on the 14th of last month, and paid for, like the physician's second and undeclared installment, from an account that answers to the Queen Consort. Lassiter began and stopped, and I saw him look once helplessly toward Morwenna, the way a drowning man looks toward the shore he can no longer reach. Do not look at her, Master Lassiter, the king said very quietly, and there was something in his voice now that made the whole room go still in a new way, not anger exactly, but the immovable patience of a man who has decided, finally, that he is done being managed. Look at me. You have served this household honestly, by every account I have ever heard, for 6 years. I am asking you, as your king, to continue being honest for 1 more minute, whatever it costs you, because I promise you the cost of the alternative will be very much higher. The silence that followed felt, to me, longer than any that had come before it in that room, though I am told by my own pocket watch, checked afterward against the mark I had made in my own notes, that it lasted perhaps 11 seconds. "The wax was mine," Lassiter said, and his voice, when it finally came, had lost every trace of the brisk professional composure it had walked in with. "I purchased it on the 14th, as the ledger shows. I sealed the altered instrument myself, in the small study off the Queen Consort's apartments, using an old seal die that had been kept among her late husband's, among the household's older effects. I did not draft the change to the clause. I do not have the hand for legal language and never pretended to. I was given the wording already written, and told only to copy it faithfully onto a fresh sheet, in a script close enough to the original clerk's that no one would look twice, and to seal it after." "Given by whom?" the king asked, though I think every soul in that room already knew the answer and was only waiting, out of some last mercy none of us quite understood the shape of, to hear it said aloud rather than simply assumed. Ivor Lassiter closed his eyes for a moment, the way a man closes his eyes before a blow he cannot avoid and has decided, at last, not to flinch from. "By the Queen Consort, Your Majesty," he said. "By my own mistress. I am sorry. I am more sorry than I know how to say in a room like this one. I told myself at the time that it was a small legal correction, an old error being tidied, nothing that would ever come to a king's attention or do any real harm to anyone. I have known, for some weeks now, that I was lying to myself when I believed that, and I have not had the courage to say so to anyone until this moment, when a guardsman's ledger left me no other honest thing left to say." The king turned very slowly to his wife. Morwenna did not deny it. "That, I think, more than anything else that happened in that room, is the detail I have carried longest, because I had half expected, we had all, I think, half expected, even Blackwell, though he would not have admitted it aloud, that she would fight to the very last inch, produce some further explanation, some further reframing of gracious concession that left the deepest truth of it still standing untouched. She did not. She stood very straight, her hands still folded before her, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, and something in her face that had been held so carefully composed through every minute of that morning simply, I do not know a gentler way to put this, gave way, the way a wall gives way not all at once but in one long silent settling, so that you understand, watching it, that it has already fallen even before the dust comes down. "Yes," she said finally, "it was mine, all of it. The instrument, the wax, the letters I should never have touched, the physician I should never have hired to frighten a child who was never truly ill a day in her life. It was mine, Alaric, every part of it, and I will not stand here and let this good, frightened man carry a single ounce of blame that belongs to me alone. He did what I told him to do because I am his mistress and he trusted me, and I abused that trust the same way I abused every other trust in this house, for longer than any of you have known to look for it." No one spoke. Outside, the cart on the gravel had long since gone, and the ordinary sounds of the palace's morning had thinned to almost nothing, as though even the house itself had gone quiet to listen. "Why?" the king asked, and it was not the voice of a king any longer in that word. It was only the voice of a man who had shared a marriage bed and a decade of ordinary mornings with a woman he had just watched confess to conspiring against his own son, and who wanted, before anything else was decided, to understand the shape of the thing that had been living beside him all that time, without his ever once seeing it clearly. Morwenna looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice had dropped to something I had never heard from her before, in all my years of distant palace acquaintance. Not the practiced gentleness she used in public, not the sharpened composure of an hour before, but something smaller and rawer, a voice with all its armor finally set down. "Because I have spent 9 years in this house watching a dead woman be loved more than I have ever once been permitted to be," she said. "I do not say that to excuse what I did, Alaric. There is no excusing it, and I do not ask you to try. But you asked me why, and I would rather you have the true answer than a kinder lie, since I have told this family enough of those already. Isolde is a saint in every mouth in this kingdom, and I am, at best, the woman who came after her, tolerated, useful at state dinners, and utterly certain, Alaric, in the coldest hour of every night I have lain awake in this palace, that the moment you are gone I will be nothing here at all, not remembered, not mourned. Simply removed, quietly, the way a season is removed when the next one arrives. I told myself that if I could not be loved the way she was loved, I could at least make myself necessary. Necessary to the succession, necessary to the children, a hand no one could simply write out of the story once you were no longer here to keep me in it. She stopped, and something that might have been the beginning of tears stood in her eyes without yet falling. It was a small, cowardly, terrible way to try to matter. I have known that for weeks, if I am honest, and I did not stop, because I did not know how to stop without becoming, in my own mind, exactly the nothing I was so afraid of being. I have thought a great deal since that morning about what it means that I found myself, for one unguarded moment, pitying her. I do not offer that as an argument for her defense, and I want to be careful here, because I have heard this story retold since in ways that soften it more than I think is honest, and I do not want to add to that softening. She had altered a legal instrument of the crown to erase her own stepson from his father's regency. She had gone through a young wife's private letters, looking for anything she could use or destroy. She had paid a man to frighten a family with a lie about a child's health, in order to take that child out of her parents' hands under the cover of medicine. Those things remained true in the room, unchanged by anything she said afterward, and no grief of hers, however real, unwrote them. But I had spent 19 years believing that villains in a story such as this one were simple, and Blackwell had spent 6 weeks teaching me, without ever once saying so directly, that the truth is rarely so obliging. A woman could be afraid and grieving and genuinely unloved in the particular, lonely way of a second wife living in a first wife's long shadow, and still choose, again and again, across months, to answer that fear with deceit rather than with honesty. Both things were true of her at once. I have not found, in the years since, a way to make the story simpler than that, and I have stopped trying. King Alaric did not answer her at once. He stood, finally, and walked the short distance to the tall windows, and stood with his back to the room for what felt like a very long time, looking out at whatever ordinary morning was still happening beyond the glass. The cart long gone now, the dog quiet, the palace turning over its 1,000 small tasks in complete ignorance of what had just been settled in this one room. "I loved her," he said at last, without turning around, and for a moment I thought he meant Morwenna, and then understood from the particular stillness that came over Rowan's face that he meant Isolde, and that he was answering, in his own roundabout way, the accusation underneath everything Morwenna had just confessed, the accusation that he had let a dead woman's memory crowd out a living wife's need to be seen. "I loved her for 20 years, Morwenna, and when she died I thought I would never again feel anything but the absence of her, and then you were kind to me, in a season when I badly needed kindness, and I married you honestly believing I could build something new that did not require me to stop grieving what I had lost. I did not intend to make you compete with a memory. I am sorry if that is what it became in the quiet of your own mind over all these years, and I am sorry I did not see it happening until a guardsman's ledger forced me to." He turned, finally, and his face was wet, though his voice had not broken. "But you did not come to me with that grief, Morwenna. Not once in 9 years did you sit across from me and say the words you have just said in front of my son and a room full of witnesses. You went instead to a forger's wax and a false physician and a stolen letter, and I cannot forgive the road you chose simply because I understand now why you felt you had no other one." "I know," Morwenna said very quietly. "I am not asking you to forgive the road, Alaric. I have given up any right to ask you for that." "Your Majesty." Captain Blackwell had not moved from his place at the table through any of it, and when he spoke now his voice was, as it had been all morning, level and unhurried, though I thought I heard, underneath it, something that had not been there before, not softness exactly, but a kind of careful weight, the sound of a man choosing his next words with more care than any he had used yet. I would ask leave to say one thing before your majesty decides what is to be done. It is not my place to counsel a king on the punishment of a queen, and I will say nothing further on the matter if you tell me to hold my tongue." "Say it, Captain," the king said. "You have earned the right to be heard in this room today more than any man living, myself included." "I did not spend 6 weeks building this case because I wanted to see the queen consort destroyed," Blackwell said. "I want that understood plainly, by everyone in this room, and by her most of all. I built it because a prince had been quietly erased from his own father's regency, a child had been frightened with a lie, and a family that deserved the truth was being kept from it by someone with the standing to keep it from them indefinitely, if no one troubled to look closely enough. The evidence was the whole of my duty. What your majesty does with it now is a king's business, not a guardsman's, and I would be overstepping badly if I told you what that judgment ought to be." He paused. "I will say only this much, because I believe it is true, and I do not think it dishonors the seriousness of what she has done to say it. There is a difference between removing a danger and destroying a woman, and I have found, in my own small experience of this work, that the first can very often be accomplished without requiring the second. Whatever your majesty decides, I would ask that it be a decision made in that spirit, if it can be." The king looked at him for a long moment, and something in his exhausted face eased, very slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when someone has said, out loud, the thing he had already begun to feel his own way toward and had not yet trusted himself to say. "You are a strange kind of soldier, Captain Blackwell," he said. "You have spent an entire morning building the most thorough case I have ever seen laid before a throne, and now that it has done its work, you are the first voice in the room to ask for mercy in how it is used." "I do not think the two are in conflict, your majesty," Blackwell said. "A case built on the truth does not need cruelty to finish its work. The truth, laid out fully and plainly, is already the whole of the consequence. Everything after that is simply the shape a king chooses to give it." Lord Chancellor Thorne, who had been silent since his earlier warning about the law, stepped forward with the particular brisk relief of a man whose profession has finally found solid ground to stand on again. "If your majesty is inclined toward a resolution that does not require a public tribunal, and I would counsel, now that we have a confession freely given, in this room before witnesses, that such a course is both possible and, I think, wiser than the alternative. Then the mechanism exists within the Crown's own household law to address every part of what has been confessed here today, without either scandal or violence, and entirely within your majesty's own lawful authority." "Tell me the mechanism, Cassius," the king said. "I find I would rather hear it from you, plainly, than decide it alone in anger, which is not a frame of mind I trust myself to legislate from this morning." Lord Chancellor Thorne drew a slim folio of his own from beneath his arm. I understood afterward that he had brought it into the room already, in anticipation of exactly this moment, which told me he had believed in the strength of Blackwell's case, rather more than his earlier caution had let on, and laid it open on the table beside the ledgers and the letters and the 2 Regency instruments, true and false, still lying side by side where Blackwell had first set them down. "By your majesty's own authority as head of the Crown and of this household, and without any need for a public tribunal, the following may be done by royal instrument this morning, witnessed and recorded, and entered into the Crown's own settlement papers," Thorne said, and I understood from the particular formal cadence that came into his voice that he was no longer speaking as a worried counselor, but as the instrument of the law itself. The way a man's voice changes when he stops offering an opinion and begins reciting a thing that will, from this moment, simply be true. First, the false instrument is void from the date of its making, and the true instrument, recovered from the late Queen's safe and authenticated by Master Lin's testimony, is restored as the Crown's sole and binding Regency instrument. Crown Prince Rowan named first among the Council of Regency, exactly as it has always stood in law until someone unlawfully altered it. Second, the queen consort's seat upon the council of state, and her voice and vote within it, are revoked by your majesty's own hand, effective this hour, for so long as your majesty judges necessary, which I would counsel to be permanent, given what she has confessed to doing with the standing that seat afforded her. Third, her authority to affix or authorize the affixing of any household or privy seal to any instrument of the crown, in her own hand or by any controller acting on her behalf, is likewise revoked, and the seals themselves are to be surrendered to the Crown Archive by this evening. Fourth, her private household accounts, and any controller employed to manage them, pass under the direct oversight of the Crown Treasury, so that no sum may be spent, and no servant of that household paid, without the Treasury's own review. A precaution, your Majesty, against precisely the kind of unwitnessed private payment that purchased both a false physician and a stick of forger's wax. Fifth, and I say this one with particular care, because it touches the children directly, the queen consort is to have no further unsupervised authority in any matter concerning Princess Malin, Prince Torin, or Prince Bram, medical, educational, or otherwise, without the express joint consent of Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, from this day forward. He paused and looked up from the folio, and for the first time all morning I saw something almost gentle in the Lord Chancellor's dry, precise face. None of this requires her to be named publicly as anything other than what she has always been, your Majesty, your wife, and queen consort of this kingdom. None of it requires a courtroom, or a scandal that would do this family and this crown far more lasting harm than the truth itself, contained and acted upon quietly within these walls, ever could. It removes, entirely and permanently, every lever of power she used or might yet use to do what she has done today. It leaves her a woman in this house with her marriage and her name and her dignity, such as she has left of it, intact. It does not leave her a woman with the standing to ever again alter what belongs, by right and by law, to your son. The room was quiet while the king read the words over for himself, his eyes moving slowly down the folio, and I watched Crown Prince Rowan's face while his father read, and saw on it something I had not expected to see after everything that had happened that morning. Not triumph, not even relief exactly, but a kind of tired, wary hope, the look of a man who has spent longer than he ever let show worrying that the truth, once found, might not be enough to matter against the standing of a queen, and who was only now beginning to believe that it had been enough after all. Rowan, the king said, looking up from the folio at last. This restores you, formally and finally, to the place that was always yours. I want to say, before I sign anything, that I am sorry it required 6 weeks of a guardsman's quiet labor and a clerk's ledgers to see what should have been plain to me as your own father, watching my own house, months ago. I did not see it. I want you to hear me say that plainly, because I think a father owes his son that admission before he owes him anything else. You see it now, Rowan said. His voice, when it came, was rougher than I had yet heard it. That is what matters to me, father, not that it took 6 weeks. That it took 6 weeks and still happened, rather than never happening at all. The king nodded once and looked down at the folio again, and I understood, from the particular way his hand moved toward the pen that Ferris had quietly set at his elbow at some point I had not noticed, that the moment had arrived, and that whatever came next in that room would be final in a way that nothing said aloud, however true, could quite match. Morwenna, he said before he signed, I am going to sign this. I want you to hear before I do that I am not signing it to humiliate you, and I am not signing it out of anger, though I confess the anger is there, and I will not pretend to you that it is not. I am signing it because I am king of this house before I am your husband, and a king who lets a private grief go uncorrected, because it wears a wife's face, is not a king I am willing to become, whatever it costs either of us personally to avoid it. Morwenna had not moved from where she stood since her confession, her hands still folded in front of her, though the folding had gone, I noticed, from the composed posture of a woman holding court to something closer to a woman, simply holding herself together. "I understand," she said. "I would have signed it myself, Alaric, if the pen had been mine to hold. I do not say that to seem noble. I say it because it is true, and because I have run out this morning of any other kind of thing to offer this room." He signed it. "I want to record, because I was the clerk of the Privy Chamber, and it was, in the end, my particular and peculiar duty to witness such things and set them down accurately, that the king's hand did not shake when he did it, though I saw, in the set of his jaw as the pen moved, exactly how much that steadiness cost him. Lord Chancellor Thorn signed beneath him, as witness and as the Crown's own legal officer, and then, because the household law required a third and independent witness to any instrument touching the Queen Consort standing, he turned to me. "Clerk Pharaoh, you are the Crown's own recording officer for this chamber. Will you witness it?" My hand, unlike the king's, did shake a little as I took up the pen. 19 years of careful, unremarkable clerkship had not prepared me for the particular weight of putting my own ordinary name beneath a king's on a document that would, from that hour, change the whole shape of a royal household. But I signed it, Elias Pharaoh, clerk of the Privy Chamber, in the plain, careful hand I had spent a lifetime training into evenness, and set the pen down and felt, more than anything else in that entire long morning, a kind of astonished gratitude that I had been the one standing there to do it. "Ivor Lassiter," the king said, turning to the controller, who had stood through the whole of the signing, in a silence so complete I had almost forgotten he remained in the room. "You have confessed to forging a legal instrument of the Crown and sealing it with intent to deceive. That is a matter for the Crown magistrates, not for me alone to settle in this room, and I will not pretend otherwise to spare your feelings, though I will say, for whatever it is worth to you, that your honesty this morning, once it finally came, will be entered into the record alongside the charge, and a court may judge that honesty as it sees fit to weigh it. You are dismissed from the Queen Consort's service, effective immediately, and you will remain under guard until the magistrates are ready to receive you." "I understand, Your Majesty," Lassiter said, and there was, in his quiet voice, something that sounded almost like relief, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a lie so long that even a punishment feels lighter than the weight of continuing to carry it. "And the physician," the king said, turning back to Blackwell, "the false Dr. Croft, already in the custody of the magistrates, Your Majesty, on charges of fraud and practicing medicine without license, as I told you earlier," Blackwell said. "I saw no reason to wait for this morning's proceedings before securing him. A man capable of frightening a family with an invented illness is not a man I was willing to leave at liberty a single day longer than necessary, whatever else this inquiry turned up." "Good," the king said, and for the first time that morning something like simple, uncomplicated approval crossed his tired face. "Good, Captain. That was correctly done, and I am glad, amid everything else this morning has cost this house, that at least that much was handled exactly as it should have been." He set the pen down at last, and looked around the room at Rowan and Alara, at Godfrey Lynn still seated by the window with his blackthorn stick across his knees, at Lord Chancellor Thorn closing his folio, at Blackwell standing exactly where he had stood since we entered, at me, and at Morwenna, still upright, still composed in whatever way she had left to be composed, though something in her had gone, I thought, permanently quieter than it had been an hour before. "I would like the room now," the king said, "all but my wife. I find there is one more thing that wants saying, and I would rather it were said privately, between the two of us, than in front of witnesses who have already, I think, seen enough of this family's private grief for one morning." We went. Godfrey Lynn first on his stick, pausing at the door to bow once more deeply toward the king, and then, after a small hesitation I noticed and have never forgotten, toward Morwenna as well, not a bow of forgiveness, I think, but simply the old formal courtesy of a man who had spent his whole life inside the etiquette of that house, and did not know, even now, how to leave a room without observing it. Then Lord Chancellor Thorn, gathering his folio, murmuring something about drafting the formal instrument for the crown's own seal before midday. Then Rowan and Alara, Rowan pausing at the threshold to look back once at his father, a long look that said more than I could have set down in a week of careful clerking, before Alara's hand found his sleeve and drew him gently on. Ivor Lassiter was led out by two of Blackwell's own men, quietly, without incident, his head down. And then only Captain Blackwell and I remained, gathering the box, the ledgers, the folded letter, the two instruments, true and false, while the king and the queen consort stood on either side of the long oak table in a silence that had already begun to belong entirely to them and not to us. I do not know what passed between them after that door closed. I want to be honest about that, because I have heard this story told since, more than once, by people eager to fill in that silence with whatever version served the telling best, that she wept and begged forgiveness on her knees, or that he raged at her until the household staff 2 floors below could hear it, or a dozen other things I have no way of knowing to be true or false. I was not in the room. I have chosen in the years since not to invent what I did not witness, and I will not begin doing so now, at the very end of this account, simply because a tidier ending might make for a better story. What I know is only this: that when Blackwell and I passed back through that gallery an hour later, having delivered the documents to the Crown Archive under Lord Chancellor Thorn's own seal, the door to the Privy Study was still closed, and that when it finally opened, some while after that, Morwenna came out alone, her face composed again in the old practiced way, though her eyes, I thought, looking older than they had looked that morning, and she walked the length of the gallery without stopping to speak to anyone, and went, I later learned, directly to her own apartments, where she remained by her own choice for the better part of the following week. I asked Captain Blackwell, some days later, whether he thought the king had been cruel to her in that private hour, or gentle, or something that was neither. I don't know, he said, and I have made my peace with not knowing. I was not put in that room to judge the shape of a marriage, Pharaoh. I was put there to make certain the truth had a fair hearing before the only man in this kingdom with the standing to act on it. Whatever passed between them after the door closed belongs to the two of them, and I think that is exactly as it should be. Not every consequence of an inquiry needs a guardsman's eyes on it to be real. It was, I have come to think since, the truest single sentence anyone said to me in the whole course of that long, strange season, though it took me longer than it should have to understand why. The formal instrument was drawn and sealed within the week, exactly as Lord Chancellor Thorn had described it in the Privy Study. The false Regency instrument declared void from its making, the true one restored, Crown Prince Rowan's name set back into the Council of Regency clause in ink so fresh. It still smelled faintly of the Chancellor's own study when I filed the Crown's copy into the archive with my own hands. The Queen Consort's seat on the Council of State stood empty at the next sitting, and at every sitting after, and though the household made careful conversation around the empty chair for a month or two, in the particular way palaces manage to say a great deal by saying nothing at all, no one, to my knowledge, ever asked aloud why it remained so. Ivor Lassiter was tried before the Crown magistrates some 6 weeks later, and his confession, entered into the record exactly as the king had promised, alongside the charge, earned him, I am told, a sentence considerably lighter than the forging of a royal instrument might otherwise have carried. He served his term at a crown holding in the eastern provinces, and was, the last I heard of him, working as an ordinary bookkeeper for a grain merchant in a market town far from Harrogate, his name known to no one there, which I have always privately thought was very nearly the kindest sentence the law could have handed a man who had, in the end, told the truth the moment a king asked him to. The false physician, tried separately on his own charges of fraud, was less fortunate, and I will not trouble you with the particulars of a sentence that belongs properly to a courtroom and not to this account. And Princess Malin, I want to tell you about Princess Malin, because I think it matters more than any of the rest of it, in the long accounting of that whole affair, that a 9-year-old girl who had never truly been ill a day in her life went back, within a week, to whatever 9-year-old girls in that household ordinarily did with their mornings, entirely unaware, so far as her parents could arrange it, of how close she had come to being taken from them under a stranger's false diagnosis. I saw her myself, some months later, crossing the east lawn at a dead run with her younger brother Bram trailing behind her shrieking with delight about something involving a wooden sword. And I thought, watching them, that this 2 children running across an ordinary lawn on an ordinary afternoon, entirely ignorant of the quiet war that had been fought and won on their behalf in a low-beamed room they would likely never hear about, was the truest measure of what that whole long morning had actually accomplished. Not a queen's humiliation, not even, quite, a prince's vindication, though that mattered enormously to the people it belonged to. Simply this: a family restored to the ordinary safety of not being watched, not being managed, not being quietly maneuvered by someone they had trusted, free to run across a lawn in the sun without anyone's hidden hand shaping what came next. The reaffirmation ceremony that Captain Blackwell had halted a fortnight before all of this came to its resolution was held again, some 3 weeks later, in the same long chamber it had been meant to happen in the first time, before the same assembly of the Council of State, minus one empty chair that everyone had by then quietly learned not to remark on. I was permitted to attend as the recording clerk, standing at my small table near the door with a fresh ledger open before me, and I watched Crown Prince Rowan step forward when his name was called and receive. This time, the true instrument seal pressed formally into the wax beside his own signature, in front of the whole council, in front of his father, in front of Alara and the 3 children, tall and solemn in a coat too formal for his age. Bram fidgeting happily with the hem of his own sleeve until Alara's hand settled on his shoulder, and Malin standing very straight beside her mother in a manner that told me, watching her, that some private sense of the day's importance had reached her after all, however carefully her parents had tried to shield the particulars of it from her. I have stood at that recording table for a great many ceremonies in 19 years of service, most of them dutiful and few of them moving, but I confess that when the Lord Chancellor read the restored clause aloud, Crown Prince Rowan, first among the Council of Regency, as it had always stood before anyone unlawfully altered it, I found my own eyes unexpectedly wet, and had to look down at my ledger for a moment longer than the entry strictly required, and I was not, I noticed, the only clerk in that chamber to do so. Queen Consort Morwenna did not attend. I want to record that plainly and without embellishment, because I think it tells you more about the shape her life had taken in those 3 weeks than any description I could offer. She had not been forbidden the ceremony. Nothing in the instrument Lord Chancellor Thorne had drafted stripped her of the right to stand among the council and watch her stepson receive what had always, in truth, belonged to him. But she chose, of her own will, not to come, and sent instead a brief note to Rowan, delivered by her own hand to his apartments the evening before, which he showed to no one but Alara, and which I never saw and never asked to see, because I had decided by then that some things in this account were simply not mine to know. Captain Blackwell stood at the back of that chamber throughout the ceremony, in the plain dress uniform of the household guard, as unremarkable and as still as he had been on the first morning I ever worked beside him. And if anyone in that grand assembly understood that the whole of the day's solemn correctness rested on 6 quiet weeks of one guardsman's patient, unglamorous labor, the pension records checked, the ledgers cross-referenced, the chandler questioned, the safe finally opened after years of no one thinking to ask what might be inside it, nothing in his bearing asked them to notice it. He simply stood and watched, the way he had stood and watched at 100 ceremonies before this one that had required nothing extraordinary of him at all, and I understood, watching him from my recording table, that this was precisely the point of the man. He did not do the work to be seen doing it. He did the work because the work needed doing, and he would have done exactly the same 6 weeks of patient, unglamorous labor. I believed then and believe now, even if no ceremony had ever come at the end of it to make the doing visible. King Alaric found him afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, while the council filed out around them in their formal dress, and I happened to be near enough, gathering my ledgers, to hear the whole of what passed between them, though I do not think either man noticed me there, or would have minded much if they had. I have been trying to think, Captain, what a king properly offers a man who has just saved his son's inheritance, and, I suspect, a good deal more than that, the king said. A title feels too small a thing somehow for what you did, and too large a thing for what you would accept. I would not accept a title, Your Majesty, if it please you not to offer one, Blackwell said. I have never wanted to be a man other people point at in a room. I would rather simply continue standing my post, if Your Majesty has no objection. That is precisely the answer I expected from you, and precisely the reason I am going to insist on something anyway, Alaric said, and there was, in his voice, something warmer than I had heard from him at any point in that long, hard morning 3 weeks before. You will accept a rise in rank within the household guard, whether you want the attention it brings or not, because I require an officer of sufficient standing to be trusted with matters of this household's private security going forward, and I have precisely one man in this kingdom I trust to hold that standing without letting it change him. You may hate the ceremony of it as much as you like, Captain. You will still stand for it. Then I will stand for it, Your Majesty, Blackwell said, and I thought, watching the small, rare thing that might almost have been a smile cross his face, that this was as close as I would ever see the man come to looking pleased with himself. Though I would ask one thing in return, if Your Majesty will permit a guardsman one further impertinence today. After the warning you gave me 3 weeks ago, Captain, I believe you have earned the right to a great many impertinences. Name it. Clerk Pharaoh, Blackwell said, and I felt my whole body go still, the way you go still when you hear your own name spoken in a conversation you had believed yourself invisible to. None of what was laid before you that morning would have held together without his ledgers. I traced the threads. He proved them, page by page, in a form no court could later pick apart. I would ask that his part in this not be forgotten simply because a guardsman's part was more visible in the room. King Alaric turned and found me where I stood, half hidden behind my own small stack of ledgers, and I do not know what my face was doing in that moment, but whatever it was doing made the king's own expression soften into something almost amused. Clerk Pharaoh, he said, come here, you needn't hide behind your own paperwork in my own corridor. I came forward and bowed, rather badly I suspect, given how unsteady my knees had suddenly become. You witnessed the instrument that restored my son's place in this house, the king said. You built, by the captain's own account, half the case that made that instrument possible. I am told clerks of your standing rarely receive recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of a ledger correctly kept. I intend to correct that, in your case, with a formal commendation entered into your own service record, and a modest increase to your stipend that I hope will feel less modest to you than it will to the treasury. Will that suit you, Master Pharaoh? I do not remember precisely what I said in answer. I remember that it was inadequate, and that the king seemed to find my inadequacy at accepting gratitude rather charming, in the tired, warm way of a man who had spent a very difficult month and was glad, for once, to be handing out something other than hard judgments. I remember that Captain Blackwell, beside me, said nothing at all, but that when I glanced at him afterward, walking back down the long gallery toward the archive with my ledgers heavy under my arm once more, there was something in his quiet, unreadable face that I have chosen, in the years since, to believe was something like pride. though I never once heard him use that word about himself or anyone else in all the time I knew him. I am an old man now, telling this story a good many years after the morning it happened, and I have had a long time to decide what I actually believe it was about. Once the ledgers were closed and the instruments were sealed, and the ordinary business of the palace had folded back over the whole affair the way water folds back over a stone thrown into it. I do not believe, in the end, that it was a story about a wicked queen brought low, though there are people in this kingdom who tell it that way still, in the shorter, simpler version that travels best at a dinner table. Queen Consort Morwenna remained, for the rest of her days at Harrogate, exactly what the Chancellor's instrument had made her. A wife with her name and her marriage and her private apartments intact, and not one lever of power left in her hands to move against anyone in that house ever again. She grew, in the years that followed, quieter than I had ever known her to be in the years before, and I saw her sometimes in the palace gardens, walking alone in the early mornings before the household properly woke, and there was something in the set of her shoulders on those walks that I came, eventually, to recognize as a kind of grief worn all the way down into ordinary habit. Not the sharp grief of the morning she confessed, but the long, flat, permanent grief of a woman living out the rest of her life inside the consequence of one season's choices. King Alaric never divorced her, and never, so far as I was ever able to observe in my small corner of that household, humiliated her publicly for what she had done. He kept the marriage, in its diminished and careful form, the way a man keeps a promise he no longer entirely believes in but is not willing to be the one to break. I do not know if that was mercy or simply exhaustion. I have come to think, the older I get, that it was probably both, in roughly equal measure, and that most of the important things grown people do for one another turn out, on close inspection, to be exactly that mixture. I do not believe, either, that it was a story about Captain Blackwell's cleverness, though he was, without question, the most thorough and patient investigator I ever had the privilege of assisting in 19 years of clerkship, and I have told younger clerks since, more times than I can count, that a ledger kept honestly and checked twice is worth more in this world than any amount of shouting. What I believe now, turning it all over one final time before I set this account down for good, is that it was a story about restraint, about what a household guard's stillness is actually for, underneath the ceremony of the bearskin and the rifle and the unmoving stance at a gate that visitors photograph and never think twice about. Captain Blackwell could have gone to the king with half his evidence, weeks earlier, and made a dramatic scene of it, and very likely lost the whole case to exactly the kind of procedural doubt Lord Chancellor Thorne raised that morning. He waited instead. He gathered one more thread, and then one more, refusing every temptation to act before he was certain, refusing even the temptation of his own anger on Crown Prince Rowan's behalf, until the truth he carried into that low-beamed room was strong enough to stand entirely on its own weight, unaided by force, unaided by rank, unaided by anything but the plain, accumulated, undeniable fact of it. He told me once in the quiet weeks afterward that he had never once considered simply confronting the Queen Consort himself, alone, and demanding she confess. I asked him why not, since it would have been so much faster. Because a confession taken by force in a private room is worth nothing to anyone afterward, he said. It proves what the guard wanted proved, not what actually happened. I did not want to win an argument with her, Pharaoh. I wanted the king to be able to trust what he was shown, without ever having to wonder whether I had shaped it to my own purpose along the way. The only way to earn that kind of trust is to be more patient than the lie you are chasing, and to let the evidence itself do the part that a raised voice never can. Princess Malin is grown now, and I am told carries herself, at official occasions, with a level, watchful composure that reminds those who remember that season of her grandmother's own bearing, though she has never been told, so far as I know, precisely how close a stranger's false diagnosis once came to taking her out of her parents' house under the cover of a lie. Crown Prince Rowan sits, to this day, first among the Council of Regency, exactly where the true instrument always meant him to sit, and I have watched him, across the years since, become the kind of steady, unhurried presence in that council that I think his father always hoped he would grow into, and that I privately believe he learned, at least in part, from watching a guardsman refuse to be rushed on the worst morning of his own life. As for me, I am still, in my own small way, the clerk of the Privy Chamber, though a younger man does most of the actual carrying of ledgers now, and I spend my days more often teaching him the trade than practicing it myself. I keep in a drawer of my own writing desk a single page of notes from that morning, not the official record which lives properly in the Crown Archive where it belongs, but my own private page, written that same evening in a hand still not quite steady, because I found even then that I wanted some small piece of it kept close, in my own keeping, in my own words. I take it out sometimes on quiet evenings and read it over, and I think of a man who did not raise his voice once in the whole of that long, terrible, necessary morning, and who taught a frightened clerk, more thoroughly than any instructor ever had in 19 years of service, that the truth, patiently and honestly gathered, does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs, in the end, someone willing to carry it all the way to the room where it matters, and to set it down, quietly, exactly as it is.